Hi, I'm Rachel at Plantlife, and today we're going to be painting a Fly Agaric mushroom. It is currently autumn, which is a great season for fungi, and the Fly Agaric is one of my absolute favourites. I saw the one that inspired this painting on a walk sometime last autumn and decided it would make a very good painting subject. So today we're going to be having a go at this. It is made with watercolour and then white gouache for the spots and for some of the highlights. If you don't have gouache, you could use acrylic paint instead. I will be going over the equipment in just a moment, but if you don't have everything on the list, don't worry. You can substitute in different colors or use different paintbrushes and use whatever you have to hand. We will see how it goes. So with all that being said, let's get started. The equipment I used for this painting was some watercolor paper, a paintbrush which is number 6 pointed round. I used a smaller paintbrush to add the white dots at the end, but you could probably do it with the same one if you wanted to. I used a paper towel and I also have a regular towel just to dry my brushes. I used a pencil to draw the outline. I have 2 containers for water. I always think it's handy to have one to clean your brushes and one for fresh water. I used the palette that came with my watercolor set, and I also used some gouache. You could use acrylic paint for the white dots if you wanted, but I have some white gouache that I wanted to use. The colors that I used for this were permanent rose, cadmium red, ultramarine blue, and burnt sienna, and that is it. The first thing you will want to do is to draw your outline, and this doesn't need to be anything over the top. It's just a very basic outline, a dome on the top and then the stalk underneath. A tip when it comes to your drawing is to try and keep things nice and faint. That way, if you do make any mistakes, it's a little bit easier to erase without leaving marks underneath. And also, you can put your watercolor over the top and you don't have really thick lines underneath showing through when you're finished. The next step is to mix up the first colour that we're going to use. So I'm going to do the stem or the stalk of the mushroom first. And to do that, we're going to take some burnt sienna and a little bit of ultramarine blue. And you'll notice that this mixture is very watery. We don't want it to be too dark because the stalk is pretty light on a fly agaric. Now you might find you want to watch this a few times before you give it a go, because once we start painting then we tend to work pretty quickly. With watercolour usually you have to make quite quick decisions depending on the style that you're going for, so if you want to watch this through a few times first before you make an attempt, then feel free to do so. So we're going to take that colour and we're going to outline our stalk, and we're going to cover all of that space right from the top of the cap all the way down, and you want to keep this really nice and light. Add a little bit more water if it comes out a little bit too dark, and we're going to just drag that all the way around. I'm now adding a little bit more ultramarine blue and burnt sienna into that mixture so it's a teensy bit darker than it was before, and we're going to use that for a shadow colour. We're going to put that on the top edge of the stalk just underneath the cap and let that flow down. Because the paint's already wet underneath, that's going to mix and blend quite nicely. We can also use that colour in areas where we want a little bit of shadow or a bit more added interest. So I'm just going to put some random shadows down here, a few spots on the stalk. We can draw some lines down the centre. It's just to make it a little bit more interesting so it's more varied and detailed. You can change things up if you like. I'm going to add a bit more burnt sienna into this so we've got some different colours in that stalk, and just put a few dots of the burnt sienna mixture in there as well. You want to make sure that everything's still wet when you're doing this so that it's still blending. The next part can be a little bit tricky, so it might take a bit of practice, but we're going to try and lift some colour out now. So I'm taking my brush and I'm just wiping it on the painting to try and create some lines and some detail work, and we're trying to lift out the paint as we do that. Now you don't want your paintbrush to be too wet when you try this because you'll add too much water and it will have a weird effect. And every time I'm lifting the paint, I'm wiping that paintbrush on my towel just to remove any excess, and then I'm going back and repeating the process. So next we're going to move on to the cap, and we're going to pre-mix our colours so we're ready to go. We're going to have a slightly lighter version. I'm mixing the permanent rose and the cadmium red for that, and then we're going to have a darker version where again we'll start with permanent rose and cadmium red, but we're also going to add a little bit of ultramarine blue in there as well. Make sure that everything is dry before you start the next section, and then we're going to start with our darkest colour on the bottom, and we're going to gradually get lighter as we move up the cap. A tip here is to work quickly, so it's good to have an idea of what you want to do before you start painting, because you don't want any of this paint to dry. You want all of this to be nice and wet as you're adding extra paint on top of it, otherwise you're going to end up with some weird watermarks. As we get about halfway up, I'm going to switch to the slightly lighter mixture. And then as we get further up still, I'm going to add a little bit more water just to drag the top of that mixture out to the rest of the cap. So we're hopefully going to have a bit of a gradient here where we're going to start off dark at the bottom and then get gradually lighter as we move up the mushroom. Don't worry if this doesn't look perfect, because once this is dry we're going to go over it again, but it's just to establish that initial gradient in the first place. While it's drying, you can be pre-mixing your colours again. We're going to use the exact same colours, the cadmium red and permanent rose in the top tray there, and then the darker version is going to be cadmium red, permanent rose and ultramarine blue. I might make these a little bit darker, and to do that it just means adding less water and more paint. This is the part where it's really important to make sure what you painted before is definitely dry before you decide to go over it again. You also don't want to do a lot of movement with your paintbrush, because if you scrub away at the paper too hard, you're going to lift up the paint that you applied first. So we're just adding this nice and gently over the top. Again, you want to keep the paint moving, and this time we're going to take that lighter mixture all the way up to the top. It's going to appear a little bit lighter because we didn't put a lot of paint there the first time round. And if you want, you can try and lift some of the colour off of the top, because that is where our sunlight's going to be hitting, so we want the mushroom to be lighter on the top and then gradually get darker as we move down the cap. I'm going to use white gouache to add the white spots, but this is where you could use acrylic if you prefer. Now the trick here is to vary how you apply the paint so the spots look a little bit different. In the areas where you want the spots to be really bright and stand out, you want to add quite a thick amount of mixture. I might go over these several times just so they stand out, because sometimes they can dry a little bit transparent. But the point is we're going over those multiple times and we're adding a lot of paint. But a fly agaric doesn't have spots that are all the same, and sometimes the spots can be a little bit darker. So to achieve that effect, I am taking a tiny amount of gouache on the end of my brush. I'm not adding a lot of water, and I'm just kind of lightly scratching my brush over the surface. You just want to drag it over without applying too much pressure, and that way we're going to get some lighter marks where you can still kind of see the background color of the mushroom shining through, and that way the spots are going to end up looking a little bit darker. We're going to repeat that process all the way over the cap and vary the marks up a little bit so they don't look all the same, and that way you're going to achieve a slightly more natural look. Go over the spots as many times as you need just to get the desired effect. Now when you finish this part, you might want to leave it just as it is and not do any more to it, and I think it looks pretty good as it is, so you could just finish here if you wanted to. I'm going to add a little bit more detail just to make it look slightly more realistic, so that's what we're going to do now. I'm mixing up that dark red colour again with the permanent rose, cadmium red and a little bit of ultramarine blue. And I just want to darken up the underneath of the mushroom around some of those lower spots, because I think it's looking a little bit too light and I want that gradient to be more obvious. You could do this step before you add the spots, but the reason I'm doing it now is because sometimes you can't necessarily see the changes you want to make until after you've done a little bit more work on your painting. And so it wasn't until the white spots were added that I realized, actually, I think it would have been nicer just to make the bottom a little bit darker. So I'm just painting around some of those spots just to make it look a little bit more shadowy underneath. I also wanted to add a bit more detail to the stalk, so I'm pre-mixing a couple of colours here, and I'm using ultramarine blue and burnt sienna of varying quantities, so sometimes it's a bit more blue and sometimes it's a bit more on the burnt sienna side. There's also a bit of red in there because I don't think I washed my brush properly before, so it's a good mixture, and I just want to go over some of the shadowy areas of the stalk again so that it looks a little bit more detailed and it's not as light as it was before. This stage is all about adding additional detail. Now, you don't need to do this. Like I said before, it would have been fine as it was, but I like to add these extra little bits and pieces because it makes each painting slightly more unique. And in this last stage, I'm back to the gouache. So now is a good time to revisit the spots on the top of the cap because they've had a good amount of time to dry, so I can see if any need going over again. It's also an opportunity to add some highlights to the stalk. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm just dragging some gouache over the bits that we've already painted just to add in a little bit of extra detail and some highlights. I always think it's so easy to overdo a watercolor painting because there's always something else you want to add. So this is a fine balance between adding things to try and make it look better and trying not to go too over the top. And that just about brings us to the end of this painting. So there we have it, a lovely Fly Agaric watercolour and gouache painting. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today and for having a go at this painting if you did. I really hope you enjoyed it.